Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Charleston for this eagerly awaited event. The Bloomsbury Group, for whom Charleston was a country retreat, are known to have dominated many fields, the fields of literature, art, design, and economics in particular. But one area that still has to be studied in depth is the relationship between Bloomsbury and sport. So I thought we should put this evening's event into context by showing you very early evidence of a love of cricket amongst Bloomsbury. Could we have a slide on the slide? Somewhere in a minute, miraculously by magic, will appear a slide that shows Virginia and Vanessa Stephen as young girls playing cricket at Talent House near St Ives. No, that's not. No. The best laid plans. I could describe it to you. And it's true. It's a photograph from Charleston's own collection, and it shows there you have it. Yeah. So Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell playing cricket in the 1890s. And I think in a minute perhaps we can discuss exactly what's going on there. I like to think, but for the stiflingly repressive late Victorian, early Edwardian England, they had the makings of first-rate cricketers and could have rewritten the story of pre-First World War English cricket if only they had the chance. So an event like this at Charleston is long overdue, an event that focuses on cricket and baseball. And we couldn't be more fortunate with our speakers this evening. We have Chad Harbach, who's nearest to me, Anthony Quinn, who's furthest away from me, and Ed Smith in the middle. And I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about each of them. Chad is just the second speaker at today's festival who's flown over the Atlantic specially to talk at the Charleston Festival. We're delighted to have him here. His debut novel, The Art of Fielding, came out last year to huge acclaim, and it deals with the big themes of love, doubt, and college baseball. And it was the US publishing sensation of 2011. It was described by The Guardian by someone with a love of alliteration as a big, beautiful blowout of a book, an exceptional debut. Chad grew up in Wisconsin. He's a graduate from Harvard, where he played baseball, basketball, and perhaps more surprisingly, golf. He's the co-founder of the internet magazine N+1, a magazine created in 2004. And he worked on The Art of Fielding for over 9 years, a process that actually is detailed in a Vanity Fair ebook. And success, you'll be pleased to learn, hasn't changed him a bit. He does admit to being now completely addicted to taking it easy, easy living, which is why he has a glass of wine and the other two don't. Then we have the film critic, author, and occasionally controversial literary prize judge, Anthony Quinn. Since 1998, Anthony has been the film critic for The Independent. He's born in Liverpool. He made the city the main character of his first novel, The Rescue Man, a book that won the Authors Club Best First Novel in 2009, and which has been described as thoughtful, beautifully observed, and utterly compelling. And his most recent novel, which Anthony is going to be talking about today, is entitled Half the Human Race, which imagines a romance between a cricketer and a suffragette. One reviewer wrote admiringly, "The nature of cricket is described with just as much insight as that of an early feminist. It would make a compelling film, but it's an even more satisfying novel." And chairing the event, we have Ed Smith, who's an author, journalist, and former professional cricketer. And he has the perfect credentials for presenting this event because he's the author of Playing Hardball, a book which compares baseball with cricket, looking at the psychology, the history, and the mythology of both games. His other books include On and Off the Field and What Sport Tells Us About Life. And his most recent book is called Luck, in which he makes a compelling case that while hard work and positive attitude is important, the interplay of chance can be decisive. One thing I discovered preparing for this event, and we were discussing this in the kitchen a moment ago, is finding out about authors is incredibly difficult. Finding out about cricketers is incredibly easy, because cricket seems to attract people who like statistics, who like to know the minutiae of their heroes' lives. So I can tell you that Ed's nickname is Smudge, that he's 34 years, 316 days old today. He scored 34 centuries during 8 seasons of first-class cricket. He's the 15th Smith to be selected for England, but he's the first Smith to have written a book about baseball. And that's probably all you need to know, and that's probably actually why Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell would never have liked to be cricketers. But anyway, please join me in welcoming Chad Harbach, Anthony Quinn, and Ed Smith.
That's going to be a hard act to follow up. Hi everyone. I'm going to read just a short bit from very early in the novel. That Thanksgiving was Henry's first holiday away from home. He spent it at the dining hall, working his new job as a dishwasher. Chef Spiridakis, the head of dining services, was a tough boss, always marching around, inspecting your work. But the job paid more than Henry had ever made at the Piggly Wiggly in Langton. He worked the lunch and dinner shifts, and afterward, Chef Spiridakis gave him a sliced turkey breast to take back to Owen's mini-fridge. Henry felt a surge of homesick joy when he heard his parents' voices on the phone that night. His mom in the kitchen, his dad lying on his back in the family room with the TV on mute, ashtray by his side, half-heartedly doing the stretches he was supposed to do for his back. In Henry's mind, he could see his dad rolling his bent knees slowly from side to side. His pants rode up to his shins. His socks were white. Imagining the whiteness of those socks, the terrible clarity with which he could imagine it, brought a tear to Henry's eye. Henry! His mother's voice wasn't Thanksgiving cheery, as he'd expected. It was chagrined, ominous, odd. Your sister told us that Owen... Henry wiped away the tear. He should have known that Sophie would spill the beans. Sophie always spilled the beans. She was as keen to get a rise out of people, especially their parents, as Henry was to placate them. Is gay. His mom let the word hang there. His dad sneezed. Henry waited. Your father and I are wondering why you didn't tell us. Owen's a good roommate, Henry said. He's nice. I'm not saying gay people aren't nice. I'm saying, is this the best environment for you, honey? I mean, you share a bedroom. You share a bathroom. Doesn't it make you uncomfortable? I sure hope so, said his dad. Henry's heart fell. Would they make him come home? He didn't want to go home. His total failure so far, to make friends, to get good grades, or even to find Mike Schwartz, made him more loath to go home than if he were having, like everybody around him seemed to be having, the world's most wonderful time. Would they put you in a room with a girl? His mom asked. At your age? Never. Never in a million years. So why would they do this? It makes no sense to me. If there was a flaw in his mom's logic, Henry couldn't find it. Would his parents make him switch rooms? That would be horrible, worse than embarrassing. To go to the housing office and request a new room assignment. The housing people would know instantly why he was asking, because Owen was the best possible roommate, neat and kind, and rarely even home. The only roommate who'd want to be rid of Owen was a roommate who hated gay people. This was a real college, an enlightened place. You could get in trouble for hating people here, or so Henry suspected. He didn't want to get into trouble, and he didn't want a new roommate. His mom cleared her throat in preparation for a further revelation. We hear he's been buying you clothes. 2 weeks prior, on Saturday morning, Henry had been playing Tetris when Owen and Jason walked in. Owen calm and chipper as always, Jason sleepy-eyed and carrying a big paper cup of coffee. Henry closed the Tetris window, opened the website for his physics class. Hi, guys, he said. What's up? We're going shopping, said Owen. Oh, cool, have fun. The we is inclusive. Please put on your shoes. Oh, that's okay, Henry said. I'm not much of a shopper. But you're not a master of litotes, Jason said. Litotes. Henry repeated it to himself so that he could look it up later. When we get back, Jason said, I'm burning those jeans. What's wrong with these jeans? Henry looked down at his legs. It wasn't a rhetorical question. There was clearly something wrong with his jeans. He'd realized as much since arriving at Westish, just as he'd realized there was something wrong with his shoes, his hair, his backpack, and everything else. But he didn't know quite what it was. The way the Eskimos had 100 words for snow, he had only one for jeans. They drove in Jason's car to a mall in Door County. Henry went into dressing rooms and emerged for inspection, over and over. There, Owen said, finally. These. Henry tugged at the pockets, tugged at the crotch. I think these are kind of tight. They'll loosen up, Jason said, and if not, so much the better. By the time they'd finished, Owen had said, there, finally, to 2 pairs of jeans, 2 shirts, and 2 sweaters. It was a modest stack, but Henry added up the price tags in his mind, and it was more than he had in the bank. "Do I really need 2?" he said. "One's a good start." "2," said Jason. Henry frowned down at the clothes. Oh. Owen slapped himself on the forehead. "Did I forget to mention? I have a gift card for this establishment, and I have to use it right away, lest it expire." He reached for the clothes in Henry's hand. "Here." "But it's yours," Henry protested. "You should spend it on yourself." "Certainly not," Owen said. "I would never shop here." He pried the stack from Henry's hands, looked at Jason. "You guys wait outside." So now Henry had 2 pairs of jeans that had loosened up slightly, but still felt way too tight. As he sat by himself in the dining hall, watching his classmates walk by, he'd noticed that they looked quite a bit like other people's jeans. Progress, he thought. I'm making progress. "Is that true?" his dad said now. "You've got this guy buying you clothes." Henry tried to think of a not untrue response. "We went to the mall." "Why is he buying you clothes?" His mom's voice rose again. "I doubt if he buys Mike Schwartz clothes," Henry's dad said. "I doubt that very much. I think he wants me to fit in." Fit into what is maybe a question worth asking. Honey, just because people have more money than you doesn't mean you have to conform to their ideas about fitting in. You have to be your own person. Are we understood? I guess so. Good. I want you to tell Owen thank you very much, but you cannot, under any circumstances, accept his gifts. You're not poor, and you don't have to accept charity from strangers. He's not a stranger, and I already wore them. He can't take them back. Then he can wear them himself. He's taller than me. Then he can donate them to someone in need. I don't want to discuss this anymore, Henry. Are we understood? Henry didn't want to discuss it anymore either. It dawned on him, as it hadn't before. He was dense. He was slow. That his parents were 500 miles away. They could make him come home. They could refuse to pay the portion of his tuition they'd agreed to pay. But they couldn't see his jeans. Understood, he said.
Evening. This is a reading about, it's set in June 1913, and the speakers are Will Maitland, who's a cricketer, and his sister, Eleanor. And they're just discussing an actual historical event, a sporting event, in fact. Dead. Will had just cracked the top of his breakfast egg and laid down his spoon. The gesture felt like a mark of respect. Eleanor, with the Times unfolded across the table in front of her, nodded gravely. For some moments a hush fell over the room, distantly punctuated by the metronomic tunk of the grandfather clock, before she spoke again. In hospital at Epsom yesterday afternoon, she never regained consciousness. Two visitors had draped the screen around the bed with the Union colours. A sister of the patient and a lady friend of her mother stayed at the hospital for many hours, and on Saturday night her brother arrived at the bedside. Only members of the staff, however, were present when the end actually came. Dead. It was that odd conjunction of something that was shocking yet not surprising. The lady whose final hours the newspaper described was Emily Wilding Davison. In common with many others, Will had become uneasily preoccupied by her fate. On the Wednesday of the previous week, Miss Davison had taken the train to Epsom Downs, racecourse with a suffrage flag wound about her middle, concealed beneath her coat. During the Derby Stakes, as the horses rounded Tattenham Corner, she had run out onto the course and, attempting to grasp the reins of the King's horse, had fallen beneath its hooves. She was rushed unconscious to a nearby hospital where a surgeon tried to relieve the bleeding inside her head from the fracture. For the last 4 days, her life had hung in the balance. The Queen, who had seen the incident, was reported to have inquired about her condition. For as long as Will relied only on newspaper reports, Miss Davison's act of martyrdom remained an abstraction, unsettling, of course, but essentially elsewhere. It was upon seeing it for himself that the full horror overtook him. He had been walking down Baker Street when he noticed a queue outside a dingy little music hall. It was now the fashion for such places to show Pathé newsreels of recent public events, royal weddings, society gatherings, popular demonstrations. Will would have passed right by the hall, but for his eye snagging on that day's bill of entertainment, suffragette incident. His curiosity piqued. He bought a ticket and entered the frowsy darkness of the auditorium, full to the door, even this early in the evening. He sidled through the crowds in the back gallery, head silhouetted against the flickering screen as the projector whirred laboriously on. The only film that Will had ever watched for any length of time had been the report of an MCC game at Lord's, and that principally because he knew Tam featured in it. As it transpired, the reels were so imperfect that it rendered the images of the cricket near meaningless, the players moving at that jerky, farcical speed, and Will had seriously wondered if this craze for cinematography could last. He sensed a murmurous hum of anticipation. A title card announced Derby Day, 4th of June 1913. The audience seemed to close in around him. It started, the camera silently, almost primly surveying the Epsom crowd, an unsuspecting sea of hats, then a switch of angle to the horses bunched together, pounding across the turf. They turned Tattenham Corner, a racing blur of equine sinew and muscle, until nearly all had passed the camera's static gaze. Then Will saw a figure materialize, as in a dream, in front of the last rider but two, and in the blink of an eye caught the drastic impact and the tumbling havoc that followed. In the dark around him, he heard a protesting intake of breath. Though the moment had come and gone so quickly, he wondered if he had really seen it at all. But here it came again, the same sequence played on a loop, and now he began to piece it together. It was horrifying to mark how the figure ducked beneath the rails and stepped, quite daintily, around the oncoming horses. Then, an extraordinary thing, she dodged one as it thundered towards her, as if to say, "No, you're not the one I came for." She seemed to stand in the midst of them for an eternity, waiting for Anma, the king's horse, until it was almost on top of her, and then raising her hand to stop it. Will stood there, shaken, appalled. The collision had sent Miss Davison somersaulting over the ground. The horse struggled to its feet, but she and the jockey lay motionless as the crowds began streaming onto the course. He had watched it again and again, 9 or 10 times, until the sequence seemed burned onto his retina. It was that deliberate sideways step the woman made which haunted him, the calculation of it. She knew precisely what she was doing. In the days following, Will had made no mention of the Derby film to anyone, though he could not help himself thinking about it, and he waited for news of the injured woman in a private agony of suspense. If she died, would others follow her lead? Or would the government finally yield to the women's demands? He looked across the table at his sister, still absorbed in the Times. Eleanor was a rational, educated, trustworthy sort of girl. It didn't seem so terrible to him that she might have the vote one day. Indeed, he suspected that she might know a great deal more about the political process of the country than he did. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks, Chad. I've been on lots of platforms in my life, but never one that had the phrase "the art of fielding" in. It's not something I was known for as a cricketer, and I was going to lie this evening. I meant myself as an expert, but I've spotted an ex-teammate and the ex-sports editor of the Times, so I'm not going to be able to pass myself off as a great fielder. The art of batting would have been much more helpful, Chad. But I just want to talk and try and tease out of these two some themes about sport and literature. Anthony, I just want to start with you. Some people have argued that in English writing, sport's been slightly taboo or frowned upon or slightly not focused on or given its proper weight. Do you think that's true? Has it been underexplored?
Cricket as an art, I mean, as
a subject, I think. Do you think we tend to think of cricket as being a literary sport, but I can't think of J.L. Carr's Season in Sinji as a very good novel, but there aren't that many.
There aren't that many cricket novels, it's true. I think there's plenty of coverage in non-fiction, and from the point of view of stats, I mean, when I was a boy, all I ever used to do was lie on my bed and read Wisdom obsessively, and I learned things. I mean, I actually learned things by rote. So I knew, who'd carried his bat for, 26 in 1899. It was the kind of that's the way I absorbed a love of cricket. It wasn't through reading about. It wasn't reading great prose. It was just. It was just a constant absorption of stats, and actually it stayed with me, to be honest, because I still don't think there are that many great cricket novels. I mean, my novel is about cricket, but it's not. I don't think a cricket novel.
Chad, the baseball in your novel is amazingly detailed. Are you a baseball player, or is that something you had to find out about and sort of immerse yourself in?
Well, I mean, I don't want to make any claims about myself as a baseball player, but baseball was certainly, it was the game. I mean, my father played an awful lot of baseball. It was a game that he taught me how to play before I could practically stand up on my own, 2 feet, and which I played throughout school, which I played in high school, which I was sort of fairly good at, but then retired by the time I was 18. But it was, I think the kind of principle according to which I wrote this book was that I was not going to research anything. I was not going to have to immerse myself in or sort of learn anything new to write this book. I was just going to sort of depend on the things that I was already steeped in, and baseball and being one of those.
So, to what extent do you think it's a sort of novel about sport or about baseball? It was one form of human existence that you had a lot of knowledge about, so it just came very naturally.
Yeah, well, my publisher, all my publishers, would be at great pains to tell you that it's not a book about baseball. Because even in the States, they were very, very worried about this, and because it's kind of the conventional wisdom and probably also the sort of accurate wisdom that only women read novels and that women don't care for baseball. And so if you write a novel about baseball, you're just doomed and no one will ever. So when they were sort of, plotting the release of my book in the States and designing the cover, they said the one, rule that the cover designer has to follow is that there can be no indication of baseball anywhere, on the thing. And I was like, well, what happens when they turn to the first page of the book? And the jig is sort of up at that point.
The publisher's got what it wants by the time the book's been opened.
Well, right. For me personally, I think the book. It's funny because I think it's as you were saying about cricket. I think there are very few really good baseball novels in the States. There are very few sports novels that I grew up as an enormous, playing sport kind of constantly throughout my youth, totally immersed in that world, waking up every day to read the sports pages and the magazines and figure out as much as I could about what was going on. But there are very few sports novels that had ever really engaged me or appealed to me. So for me, the book really began with baseball because the book began with what happens to Henry in the course of the book and this crisis that he goes through. And that was really the kind of entry point for me. But I also never felt like I wanted to write a baseball novel.
Isn't your book actually about talent and the dread of losing talent? I think talent is such a mysterious and interesting thing. It's you don't know where it comes from, and naturally you would then fear its disappearance. It's talent. It's not just about talent in sport. It's about talent in cooking or playing a musical instrument or juggling or whatever. Talent is something that it's just something that you have, and you just naturally fear that it may one day desert you.
Yeah, because yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, in Henry's case, in Henry Scrimshander's case, that's, and in my book, there's a cricketer called Tamburlaine. They both are in the sort of that zone where they know that they're losing their talent. And the terrible thing about playing sports is that you lose your talent in front of so many people.
Well,
Well, I
you
was just going to
about
say,
that?
yeah, as someone who's done it, these people are just hypothesizing about getting the yips. I've actually, I can talk all about from these. I think what's really interesting, and it's explored in these books, is the idea that what sports people tell themselves about talent is actually not true. And people, write books about it saying there's no such thing as talent and we're in control because sportsmen are neurotic and they're obsessed with the idea of control. And of course, the reality is very different. And one of the amazing things about these two books is they explore how quickly something can go away, which has always been a very natural part of your personality. So to some extent, talent is almost like a voice, and you can lose it. And I wondered to what extent you feel that is like the same in writing, where we talk about flow in cricket or in baseball or in sport. We also recognise the same thing in writing, and sometimes it can be interrupted when we start thinking about it. Do you think that's?
I think that's massively true. Yeah, I mean, I've done a film column for the last 14 years, and hardly a week goes by when I don't sit in front of my computer screen and think, can I just still do this? It's not like it's a massive talent, but I happen to earn a living from it, so it's quite important that I can keep on doing it. I mean, I don't know what, Chad, do you think? I mean, it's just like the loneliness of writing as well has got a kind of resonance with sport too.
Oh yeah, and and that was, and as I'm writing the book and as I'm writing my way through this whole crisis that Henry goes through, I'm drawing in part on my own, very mediocre baseball career, and I'm drawing, and I've known some, I have some close friends who are much better athletes, than I. And, I'm sort of drawing on what I know of their experience. But as I got sort of deeper in the book, what I found myself drawing on more and more and more was my own struggle in trying to write the book. And that's what, and that's really, and that analogy is really what appealed to me from the start. The very first genesis of this book was that this, because what happens to Henry, this losing his ability to throw, is something that has happened to some really prominent American baseball players. And and as a fan, just watching this happen, it's so kind of profound and powerful to see, because you see these guys who are supposed to be these really sort of heroic, stoical athletes. They're these heroes. They show a lot of emotion, but they only show it in very sort of channeled sort of ways. It's sort of the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, but when this happens and this sort of doubt creeps in, all of a sudden you see these guys become vulnerable in like an entirely different way. And it's really like, I was at a game many years ago when a pitcher named Mark Wohlers was going through this, and he was in front of what should have been a sort of hostile crowd, and he's just kind of throwing the ball all over the place, and you could just he's like turning purple and like really just having a sort of anxiety attack like there on the pitching mound, and this crowd is just absolutely hushed, because you're just sort of seeing someone just kind of break open in the most kind of basic human way, like right in front of you, so I think that's what. So, I felt like this was what I was going through every day at my desk, except when you're an athlete, you go out there and do it in front of a crowd.
One of the interesting things about the yips is that it happens to some of the most confident and graceful people. I mean, Philippe Edmonds, the England bowler, Bishan Bedi, they were absolutely brilliant, beautiful, natural sportsmen. They were very, very confident, yet they suffered from it. So there's no sort of correlation between flakiness actually and suffering from this. And there's a lovely line in your book, Chad, where you say that maybe hard is easier, and it's almost like he needs to get something, he needs to find a task which is more difficult than the thing he's fluffing all the time, because the easy thing is the thing that, because he knows he has to make this throw, that it becomes even harder, and that sort of builds up extra pressure.
Oh yeah, I mean, and this is, of course, I mean, this is what you find in baseball when it happens to these players, is that the plays that they always botch are the very, very easy plays that sort of give them time to think, and that's when you have that extra moment to sort of engage your brain. That's the problem. That's the problem. And so these guys who are kind of falling apart will make the most difficult, graceful, sort of beautiful play, and then the next moment when they have a very easy one, that's the one that they totally chuck.
I was in New York in 2000, and there's a Subway Series or World Series between the New York Mets and New York Yankees, and there's Chuck Knobloch, actually the shortstop, and he threw the ball into the crowd, and it hit someone amazingly famous, didn't it? And that then became a huge talking point. Say Madonna, it wasn't, but someone like that. So there's this whole question of luck, which is in your book too, when the missed throw, the fatal missed throw, doesn't just disappear and everyone goes, that didn't really happen. It actually, well, you tell us what happens.
Well, it hits it. Henry makes this. He hasn't made a bad throw in years, and he makes one, and it happens to hit one of his teammates in the face and sends him to hospital and injures him pretty severely. And this is the beginning of Henry's whole downward spiral. And I just wanted it to be a sort of open-ended question of like what is actually happening to Henry. Is it the fact that he's kind of on the cusp of this great success? Is it the fact that he's just injured his roommate? Is it just sort of random? There are all sorts of kind of, or is it? And there are other reasons in the novel why it might be happening. But I think that's the way these things kind of work in real life, right? Is that you can't trace the origin, and if you could trace the origin, you could probably solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. The unravelling happens to a young athlete in his early 20s. In your novel, it happens to someone who's struggling to adapt to life after sport.
Yes. With my batsman, who's in his 40s, he's had great success. He's played in tests. He's revered up and down the land in the days of, the Edwardian days of little, cigarette cards when they had their portraits on them. He can't really cope. It's the one thing he was able to do, and he finds his talent has deserted him. And no matter how much he practices, he still can't get it back. I think the retirement aspect of it is quite. I mean, I wanted to express the kind of the poignancy of when a sportsman's career is over, his actual life seems to be over too, in a strange way. He can't. His reason for being has been taken away, and there's nothing else he can do.
The metaphor of death in sport is particularly, I think, apt in both these sports. In cricket, because it's the only sport in which when someone fails, the batsman, he actually has to leave the field. So it's like he is removed from the action. And Mike Brearley suggested in the prologue to the book you quote, the book about suicides by David Frith,
yes.
that may be part of that sort of metaphorical death, which is built into the fabric of your daily life, is part of it. In baseball, it sometimes happens to pitchers, where the pitcher, the manager will then come to the mound and say, that's enough, I've seen one run, you give up one run and now you're out of there. So when I was doing a book about baseball and cricket, I realised the analogy was not between batter and bowler, or batter and batter, but it was between batsman in cricket and pitcher in baseball. Both those roles have the guillotine hanging above their neck, where one mistake is maybe fatal in baseball, will be fatal in cricket.
That's why it's an incredibly lonely sport, it seems to me. I mean, not that I've ever really played it much, but it seems to be a team game that puts unbelievable pressure on the individual temperament. And when you're talking about, the metaphor of death, walking back to the pavilion, the few times I've actually played it, cricket, when you're actually dismissed and you're walking back, it feels like you're sort of dying in a way. It's like that Geoffrey Willans Ronald Searle cartoon of Molesworth walking back to the pavilion, and the caption underneath is, "Distance back to the pavilion is 23,000 miles." That's how long it feels, that walk.
You also mentioned that there's this very strange condensed nature with sporting careers. I mean, there's an amazing thread in Chad's book where Mike, who's 22 by the end of the book or something like that, he's physically, he's getting through on drugs and he's taking painkillers, and of course, for bowlers in cricket, they also, I remember my teammates would be taking sort of fistfuls of drugs every day just to get through the day, and at 23, their knees are basically gone. Now that's an extraordinary tragedy for someone who's barely an adult to be already kind of burnt out physically, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, but it's quite interesting to contrast. When my book came out last year, I was 35, and everyone was like, "Look at this young writer," and I was like, "Well, I feel quite old, I'm really kind of falling apart." But for an athlete of 35, this is you're into your dotage. And this is something that both Henry and Mike have to deal with in the course of the book, because Mike's like you say, like his body is falling apart, and he knows that it's coming to an end for him, and he has to just sort of deal with that, And Henry, because of these troubles that he's having, he's 21 years old, and he's suddenly has to contemplate. This is all he's ever thought about in his life, and that's what's really sort of poignant about it, I think, for athletes, is because every athlete kind of starts out at a very, very young age really devoting themselves and like thinking only about this thing, and then you are still at a really sort of young, barely adult age, and all of a sudden you're kind of cast away from this.
So the egg timer of life's going 5 times as fast. For
Did you dread the end of your career as a sportsman?
I think I would have found it very hard to actually make the decision. It sounds crazy, but I broke my ankle, and that I view that. I was 31, but I view that as being luck, actually, and that was what started my own book about that subject, because it was almost like an affair that had to end, but I didn't have the nerve to do it. So having the decision taken out of my hands made it easier for me, and I think it's very, very difficult to leave that image you've always carried with you, and there is that image you always have in your head, and maybe it's playing for England, doing really well, or getting what you wanted, and it's actually just finally saying that photograph's not going to happen in the way you wanted it to. That's a difficult thing. So that's why sometimes it's an event that actually just pushes you over the edge and makes you.
But do cricketers generally talk about that
I think
as the sort of the great twilight of their careers and what the hell they're going to do afterwards?
I think it's sort of there and not there. It's like most teams are amazingly emotionally illiterate, and as part of our skill, really, is not talking about what matters. Sportsmen have a code, and they talk about things that don't matter a great deal, and things that do matter they tend to avoid, particularly men, I think. And so, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? It's not kind of breakfast chat, it's a bit like saying, "Did you see that really nasty review they ran in the Times," or whatever. So I think, but it does hang over you. And also, what's really interesting is when you, in the same way that you felt young as a writer, quite mature, but people are sort of saying he's a young writer. The day you retire as a sportsman, you instantly become like 3 generations younger, because suddenly you're at the beginning of something. But the Tam really struggles, doesn't he, just to find some sense of meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's been mistaken for a gregarious man, and is in fact a rather lonely and vulnerable one, who just sort of put himself about because he was so feted and rated by his Edwardian public. And he struggles to know what to do with his life, and I found that incredibly moving. And I researched this quite a lot through that David Frith book, which is called Silence of the Heart. I don't know whether the audience knows, but the highest proportion of suicides in any sport is cricket. There's a lot of self-slaughter going on, and I don't know whether it's because cricket attracts the neurotic, or whether it's cricket that turns you into a neurotic. Because, like I said, it's just there's so much time spent on your own, batting, bowling, in the field. I mean, my God, you could just spend all day in the field and not talk to anyone, couldn't you? So I like that. I like that idea, and it linked up with writing, because writing itself is it can be rewarding, but it can also be a very lonely business.
It's interesting about someone who's been mistaken for being gregarious. I think one of the ways in which sport's interesting and again reflects life is that you get given a personality a little bit, and people say, "Oh, you're the confident sportsman," and then people act that way, and then they sort of start taking themselves in. And many times I've played in teams with people and against people who the world thought were very confident people, but up close, you knew they had no self-confidence at all, and they had this ability to perform in front of a lot of people, but it was skin deep.
I bet Ian Botham's really shy.
Chad doesn't.
No, don't.
Yeah, it's a shame Ian's not here to let us see the just completely blank expression. I want to talk about, in a nice way, I want to talk about friendship in sport. I mean, friendship runs through, and mentoring actually runs through both books. The friendship between Mike and Henry is so intense, and I won't give too much away, but there's denouement where their questions are asked. You know, to what extent does their friendship have the shape of a love affair?
Well, in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways. Boy, that's an interesting question. Well, you know, I mean, their relationship, you know, first of all, has these kind of two very different components to it. One, as you say, is a sort of mentor-student relationship, you know, which is very sort of vertical, right? And Mike sort of tells Henry what to do, and Henry does it, and they both enjoy that very much. You know, they're both sort of engaged in the role that they love to play. You know, but then they're also very close friends. And, you know, so I think part of the drama of the book is that, you know, if Henry's ever going to sort of grow up and become a real sort of conscious adult human being, he's going to have to break that mentor-student role, which has been so useful and so comforting to him, and but he's going to have to sort of become his own mentor in a way, and, you know, become an adult, and they're going to have to reform their relationship. I mean, I do think that, you know, very early on, I began to sort of conceive of my book as mostly a kind of novel about friendships between men, and that this was kind of, if I ever, I mean, I don't think you write a book, and I don't think you think about like themes, you know, like that's for somebody else to do. But if I ever did anything like that, I thought, you know, this really is in some ways a kind of book about the ways that men relate to one another, and, you know, and the ways that men relate to one another are actually quite a bit more complicated than they're often presented. You know, at least in America, like in the American popular media, and even in the American novel, a lot of times, you know, you get this very sort of truncated, simplified version of male friendship, which is, you know, the bromance is the term of art for this. Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's quite a bit more complicated than that. And there's a point in the book where Henry really starts to, where he's like, you know, he thinks about this sort of explicitly, because he and Mike have sort of broken up, and he's like, it's really complicated having this sort of really serious friendship with a you know, another male human, because there's just sort of no terms in which to think about this. And there's no sort of commitment ceremony where you say, you know, we're going to, you know, stick together.
Sometimes think that if a relationship is based on shared experiences, the wealth and weight of shared experiences for people who've played a huge amount of sport together is so intense that there's inevitably this huge emotional bond, which they usually deny. It's not only to do with sexuality, it's just to do with closeness. And the same way, I think the only instance I've seen it being closer than that is among people who are in the army together. You know, where I remember I was at a dinner once, and two guys who served together on their own, and we were chatting, and then they were joined by their wives, and they loved their wives, but they also loved each other in a way which was at least as strong in different ways. The relationship in the book is another, in your book, is a fascinating example of the tensions within mentorship as well. A younger player and an older player, and of course it isn't always going to be that way.
Yeah,
the older
course.
player is going to
it
be
begins,
a fading player.
I mean, it's cricket was a way of talking about, the camaraderie of men, the fellowship that exists between men. But there's also ambition and there's also jealousy and competitiveness. Will, the young batsman who is Tam's protege, actually starts playing like Tam, and he does the. I tried to describe it, but it's basically the Kevin Peterson flamingo swivel that you just sort of scoop.
He'll never forgive you.
No, well, I don't think he's going to read it somehow. He's sort of it's the ball that comes quite fast down leg side, and you just swivel on one leg and basically muller it over mid wicket. So there's always that element of slightly nasty competitive, not nasty, but it's very much there, and Tam knows that his career is on the teeter-totter, and Will's is on an upward trajectory. The idea of soldiery, in fact, is exactly the trajectory that Will's career follows. He starts out as a batsman, and his career is savagely interrupted by the war, where he goes to serve on the Western Front and takes Tam's cricket bat with him as his talisman. So that's the other. You're absolutely right. Cricket and soldiering, I guess, are about as intense as it gets when male friendship is involved.
There's a very moving passage in the art of fielding where you talk about the efforts of athletes to turn themselves into machines. They start off as a human being, and I think you explore, so it would be very nice to play in this artful, stylish, elegant way, but artful, stylish, elegant doesn't pay the gas bill, and this thing has to repeat, your technique has to repeat over and over and over again. And yet, I wonder whether the effort to turn yourself into a machine doesn't make you more vulnerable to complete, explosion.
Implosion.
Maybe you should answer this question.
Yeah. Well, no, but do you think, Henry has been so schematic in the way he approaches his career. He's not allowed any sort of slack into his life, has he? Do you think that makes him so taut that he's going to snap more easily?
Yeah, well, the way that I think of Henry is that he has, he has been, entirely single-mindedly focused on his sport, and so he's sort of, he's kind of taken the simplicity of the game, and he's kind of introduced that simplicity into his entire life, right? And he's sort of tried to reduce his entire life to the kind of clarity of the baseball diamond, and that works for a while, but is probably impracticable in the long run. So when a little bit of entropy kicks in, when something goes a tiny bit wrong, it not only unravels for him on the diamond, but all throughout his whole sort of life. Because he's so dedicated to this idea of total perfection that he's not able to sort of embrace a little bit of trouble.
May I ask, Chad, why you called him Henry Scrimshander? It sounds a very sort of Kipling-esque kind of name to me, rather than an American one.
Well, it's it's pretty American in a way. It's scrimshaw is the art of whalebone carving.
I didn't know that.
So it, as everyone knows, so it comes from there's an awful lot of sort of kind of talk about Melville and Moby Dick in the book.
Sure.
And so there's and there's also a point early in Moby Dick when Ishmael is staying at an inn, I think probably in Nantucket, and for no apparent reason the innkeeper keeps referring to him as Scrimshander. So I took it from there, and of course I liked it because of Scrimshander is this kind of artist, and I really think of Henry in the book as this kind of artist.
You were right. I probably was setting up a question I was asked, half trying to answer myself subconsciously. I think looking back on the question of, if you try and make yourself a machine. I think actually the one time I got the yips was in 1999 when we basically spent so much time trying to completely eliminate error. It was like we made a group decision that we weren't going to make any mistakes ever. And that actually is this thing in sport, which I think again is shared in other areas of life, where we have this obsession with efficiency. But efficiency is not the same as robustness. And in actual fact, when there's no slack in the system psychologically, it's like you're making yourself into the psychological equivalent of a racehorse which is going to get injured every time someone sneezes, within 5 miles. And I think that was what I found. And it was only when I went back to being a human being again that I actually sort of thought, well, actually, I can just be normal. But it was when I was it was my commitment to perfection, to the idea that I couldn't make a mistake because it would be a category error, that I actually made a catastrophic. I was completely unable to be myself, I think, for a short period of time.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I mean, so the two games that I sort of played incessantly when I was younger were baseball and basketball. And I feel like in basketball, you're allowed to make a lot of mistakes, and so it's rare for a player to have this kind of paralysis, because you just sort of run around, you crash into one another, and you miss shots and you make shots, and there's not this sort of you might get balled out by your coach, you might get sent to the bench, but there's not that particular kind of like pressure toward perfection, right? Because but in baseball. And I talk about this in the book. I think it's when on a baseball scoreboard there are 3 categories, and it's runs and hits and errors. And of course the only one that matters is runs, and then hits is sort of interesting. But errors, there's just no reason for that to be there except for this sort of like, it's just this sort of like parental punishment. And I think it really speaks to the kind of like, kind of philosophical sort of agony of the game, where you are just not supposed to mess up, and it puts an immense amount of pressure on especially on the fielders.
Is there any other sport that has that, where they list the errors for everyone to see?
Not like that I know of.
I mean, that's like a quote from my book. I say exactly that, and I think it's a rhetorical question, because I don't think there is. I mean, it's
grotesquely unfair, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And then and someone sort of makes a bit of a mistake, and then you sort of wait. Everyone in the stadium waits to see whether the scorer will put it up as a hit or an error, and then you're
wow.
It's arbitrary. There is one thing in cricket. Good scoreboards have names now. So, for example, the Lord's scoreboard in London. Every bit of fielding, whether it's good or bad, will have the guy will press the button, and then your name will come up. So if you drop a catch, you're left with this rather bizarre situation of hoping you get mistaken for someone else. And I was known sometimes to emulate the gait and walk and mannerisms of my teammates, having done something wrong, in the hope that the guy ascribed it to someone else. It's been absolutely fantastic. I would love to chat infinitely, but I'd love to open it up now to you on the floor. And there are a couple of microphones drifting around, and then take questions at the front. So if anyone's got a question, I'll put a hand up now.
I'd like to ask Chad, this is your first novel, and it's been absolutely acclaimed. So are you now in the position of the baseball pitcher who's reached his peak and you're now going to fall apart?
Well, I mean, I hope not. I don't really know what to say to that.
How's the pressure?
Yeah, the pressure. I get asked this question, sometimes in various forms. I don't know. I mean, it's there's an awful lot of pressure on you in writing a first novel as well, and I think in some ways even more, because the kind of culture of the publishing industry these days is that if you write a first novel and it doesn't do well, you're really in a sort of bad spot. So I mean, I guess the only answer is we'll see. In the next couple of years, as I work on this book that I'm starting to work on, but it's I mean, it's certainly a very, very different sort of pressure, and it's I mean, in some ways, it's a much nicer sort of pressure because you feel like you write a book and maybe, I mean, the whole time that I spent working on this book, it never occurred to me that anyone would ever read it, or it occurred to me, but I didn't believe, it never, I never thought that would actually come to be the case. Whereas this time the pressure is more like people are going to read it, and will they like it? So we'll see what happens.
Well, that's got the bouncers, curveballs, and beamers out of the way. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question here about the process of writing. You're both sports people, not necessarily actual active players now, but people of sport. So in the process of writing, do you start from a process of being, or a position of being a sportsman who wants to write about their sport, but sort of showing some more interesting sidelines to it? Or are you writers who are choosing sport as a basic subject? And the second part of that question is, as you're writing, does it change what you're writing about? In other words, do you start off thinking you're writing about something, but as you go through the book, it takes quite a long time to write, do you find that at the end the book's different from what it started out to be?
Well, I've got to say straight away that I'm lavishly untalented as a cricketer. My two brothers are very good fast bowlers, but I never really played much myself. Did the book become different? Yeah, I took out a lot of the cricket in it because I realised that it was getting in the way of the flow of the book. And it also, as we've been talking today, it's not just about sport. Sport's just a way of discussing other things. It's about, jealousy and ambition and loneliness and repression. My own personal experience of writing is that the books always change as you're writing, and thank God they do. I wouldn't want to be stuck along kind of rails as I was, trying to put a 300-page novel together. But you're assailed with doubts, like sports people are. I guess you just hope that you can push through them.
Yeah, I was never a tremendously good athlete, but but it was a very important part of my life for a long time, and I think that when I reached a certain age, around 20 or so, I think this is something that afflicts not only really great athletes.
Thank you so much.
You'll take that compliment.
Hour and 5 minutes.
but also, but also really mediocre ones, which is that at least in American society, one of the things that I find really interesting about sport is that it is something that you are really sort of allowed to devote yourself to in a really sort of entire way. And that is really interesting and wonderful and compelling to be able to do that. So when I was younger and when I was in high school, I was an okay athlete, but like that is what you built your life around this. And so even if you weren't anywhere near, kind of playing on a professional level, there still comes this point in your life where you're sort of bereft of this thing that was really kind of consuming. And so I think that I went through this at a certain point where I kind of felt like I had nothing in my life that was as engaging and consuming as the sport that had gone before. And I think this happens to a lot of people. And so when I was kind of starting out as a writer, I think that I sort of wished that it were more like sport in a way. I wish that I had a writing mentor who, like Mike Schwartz, who would call me up at 5:30 every morning and demand that I get to my desk, and this was this sort of so in a way the book was this sort of wish fulfillment sort of thing. Because that's what what you don't have as a writer. That's in a way, like, writing is something that I think our culture doesn't devote itself to the way that it devotes itself to sport. It doesn't channel the same resources in that direction, and so in some ways it's a sort of lonelier kind of enterprise.
Okay, this is a slightly off-the-wall question, but it's inspired by the fact that Anthony's a film critic. I just want... there equally haven't been that many good fiction films about sport. I mean, Chariots of Fire, but not too many others one can think about. So I just wonder how each of you would view the possibility of your books being turned into films, and in fact, in Anthony's case, whether he thinks that The Road of Tam would be a perfect start for Ed in the film business.
40 and suicidal. Thank you.
The job's yours if you want to. Yes, there aren't great films about cricket, are there? But I'm pleased to say that a very nice director and producer have both bought an option on it, tiny option, but they think they can make it into a film. So I'm delighted if they want to give it a try. But who knows? Who knows? I'm steering well clear of it myself.
And similarly, HBO has optioned The Art of Fielding, and I've been there's a very nice director and producer attached to it, and so I actually spent quite a bit of time with them recently, and I had been sort of intending to steer clear, and then I went and sort of spent a week with them, and we just spent the week just sort of talking about the book again. And I found myself getting sort of sucked back into the whole sort of thing, and realizing that as much as I thought that I was free of these people, I'm not actually free of these people. And so initially, when they first bought the option, I was like, oh, I don't know if I'd like to be involved. And then when I sat down and had these series of long meetings with them, suddenly I was like, I want in. Let's do that. Let's do this thing.
So will you be writing the script?
I think, the director who's attached to it is also a writer, and so I think he's the man in charge. So I'm like the sort of second in command, and I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Anthony, you said that you had left a lot of the cricket out because it got in the way of the narrative. And although sport has a narrative, perhaps it doesn't easily chime with novelistic narrative. I wonder though if sport and poetry have more in common. After all, there's the phrase poetry in motion. You have a figure like John Arlott, who's a great sports cricket commentator, who was actually quite a good poet as well.
Yes.
And the great moments in sport seem to translate into poetry in a way perhaps they don't into fictional narrative.
I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, I think cricket has got its own drama, its own rhythm. It's got characters and it's got subplots. It's got history behind it. It seems to me that you can't beat cricket at its own game. I kept on taking stuff out of the book because I thought, well, who'd be interested in this? Just this fictional game. Again, I'm sorry to keep I'm like a broken record, but it was just sport. Cricket was a way of talking about other things. In this case, it's a counterpoint to what was going on in society in 1911 to 1914. So it's a counterpoint to the suffrage movement and their campaigns of urban sabotage, whereas cricket is orderly, decorous, clubbable. What the women were doing in society, what suffragists were doing in society was unprecedented and revolutionary. And the only chime, the visual chime that I wanted to set up was men throwing cricket balls at stumps and women throwing bricks through windows. That was the only thing that was in my head when I was, trying to compare the two.
I want to add one thing. I think that it's not only writing about sport that's at its best when is actually about other things, bigger things, human nature. Sport too is at its best when it's about more than just sport. I remember when I started writing, I tried not to write about sport because I thought I wanted to write about the human condition. I mean, how stupid's that? That you're a sportsman and you don't think you're engaged in, something which is real. And it was only when I sort of got over that kind of snobbery that I realised I was sort of leaving out all my best material. And now when I watch sport, I'm really only interested, properly, fully interested, when I see sort of deeper themes, I think.
I'm very impressed by both your readings, and I thought they both sounded like wonderful books, and I'm fast becoming a convert to sport. But just in case there are any other women novel readers in the audience who aren't yet converted to sport, will either of you be writing about non-sport subjects next time around?
Yes.
Yes, actually. I don't think I'd ever try and write about cricket again. Yes, I've written another book that's coming out in October, and it's about London in 1882, and it's a mystery story, so it's got not a ball bowled in it.
I think probably on those two affirmative answers, it's the perfect moment to end. I'd just like to thank Anthony, Chad and Ed for a really wonderful discussion. We've had two fantastic readings, which should really have given you a taste for the books. And by an amazing coincidence, well, by luck, we do happen to have them on sale here tonight. We've experienced the first ever professional critique of Virginia Woolf's cricketing style. I think that the Virginia Woolf Society will be very sad that that wasn't something that they managed to achieve. I think that we've also had confirmation that cricket fans do indeed have a curious statistical obsession, thanks to Anthony's confession earlier. I'm still not quite sure whether it's good luck or bad luck Madonna being hit by a baseball, but I suspect it happened at a moment in her career when she was having the yips. I should flag up that our event within Botham discussing existentialism and ethics with Alain de Botton does still have a few tickets available if anyone is interested. But anyway, please could you give us a moment to clear the stage and go back to the bookstall at the back. But please join me in thanking Chad Harbach, Anthony Quinn and Ed Smith.